Now, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is resuming his party's election campaign with a speech linking British military action overseas to terrorist attacks here in the UK. In a moment, we're going to talk about this with Dr. Alan Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society, which is a think tank specialising in foreign affairs. And from Lancaster, we'll be speaking to Dr. Simon Maybon, who researches the international relations of the Middle East and political Islam. And he's going to be speaking to us again in just a moment. But first, I'm pleased to say that our security correspondent Frank Gardner is here. Good to see you, Frank. Now, let's talk first of all what we know about the sheer scale of investigations that are ongoing right now, not just because of the Manchester attack, but across the country.
I think it'll probably be quite a shock to people to learn that what MI5 released yesterday, that they are currently working on 500 investigations. They've got about 3,000 people on their watch list. Those are the people they know about. Those are the so-called persons of interest, of whom, by the way, Salman Abedi, the bomber, was a former person of interest. And that, I think, is going to spark some pretty serious questions being asked in Whitehall as to why they weren't on his tail a bit more closely. But 500 investigations. Currently, with the Manchester investigation, there were 10 people arrested, 2 have been released, so 8 in custody. Plus, remember that the bomber and father have both been detained in Libya by what's called I think it's a deterrent force, basically a militia that is more or less loyal to the UN-recognised government.
Now, Jeremy Corbyn has made these comments about the war on terrorism not working. Some people may be watching this, scratching their heads, saying, well, where are we on the war on terrorism? Kind of just update us on what the UK's role is right now. Sure.
First of all, personally, I've never liked that expression. I mean, you know, it's like a war on air. You can't have a war on terror. I mean, it's a sort of one of these meaningless expressions. But what it refers to is the combined international but US-led reaction to the 9/11 attacks, going right back to 2001. So it started off with Afghanistan. It started off with demanding that the Taliban hand over al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, the leaders. They refused, so they then launched what's called Operation Enduring Freedom to kick out the Taliban and destroy al-Qaeda. It's only half worked. They pushed them across the border into Pakistan, and of course attacks didn't finish. And it morphed into something called GWAT, the Global War on Terror, then the Global Struggle Against Violent Extremism. You get the idea. And of course, inevitably, some actions have been counterproductive. So take Nigeria, for example, where the government there is pursuing what it sees as terrorists with such relentless vigour that it's also killing civilians in some cases. You know, whole villages are being traumatised, and that helps recruit people for Boko Haram. So there are elements of the kind of global war against terrorism which backfire. I think Jeremy Corbyn's point is that there is a link with Britain's intervention overseas and what happens here. It's quite a risky line to go down if terrorists can use that. But then again, there's no denying that there is, you know, it's one of the planks that they use to justify what they're doing, but it's one of many. Remember that the people carrying out these attacks are generally people with who've got troubled pasts, often in trouble with the law, petty criminals and so on.
When George W. Bush launched the war on terror, if you like, there was very much a feeling that it was a global effort. Do you get the sense now that it's not so much an individual countries are pursuing their own approaches?
Well, there is a coalition against ISIS that is very active in Syria and Iraq. It's primarily airstrikes. It's US-led, but there's a lot of other countries in there as well, mostly European countries. And yesterday, NATO has agreed to join that coalition. It won't make a huge difference, but it'll lend what's called a bit more ISTAR, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and radar, basically scanning things out from the air, seeing where targets are. But that's one of the reasons why ISIS is trying to retaliate in Europe, because their caliphate is shrinking. They have brutalized the population under their control, and these airstrikes are not kind of going in willy-nilly, let's just bomb some villages. They are going in targeting, trying to rid the Middle East of this organization that has brutalized them. The people in the Middle East don't want ISIS. You know, let's be clear about this. ISIS does not represent the Middle East. It's an abomination for people there. They call it Khawarij, outsiders from Islam.
Frank, do stay with us, because I'd be keen for you to chip in on this conversation as well. I want to bring in Dr. Alan Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society. What do you make of Jeremy Corbyn's comments today saying the war on terror isn't working?
Well, I don't want to focus on Jeremy Corbyn himself. His election, people can make up their own minds about that. I mean, I think, though, the underlying argument goes to what, Frank's given us a good perspective of the architecture, if you like, or the history in recent times. I think what we're failing to do in this debate is look at what the terrorists themselves say to us, what ISIS, what Al-Qaeda have said over many, many years, which is, it's actually about us. It's about our beliefs versus their beliefs. They have clear beliefs in a radical Islamist system. They wish for those beliefs to be universal. They think that our way of life is decadent. They wish to punish us. They wish to subvert what we do in their way instead. And that's why they're attacking us. They've been pretty open about this. There are propaganda magazines that come out all the time from ISIS that explain the list of reasonings. And it's true that foreign policy is one of them, but it's down at the bottom, and they're open about it. They say it's down at the bottom because it's not the main issue. The main issue is, even if foreign policy wasn't there, we would still attack you because you are not Muslim, and in particular, you're not for our form of Muslim. And Frank's quite right to suggest ISIS does not represent the Middle East, and of course, it does not even represent any number of Muslims in this. It's a small section of that Muslim population, but it is crucially linked to a religious ideology.
I want to bring in Dr. Simon Maybon on this. Do you agree with what we're hearing there, that actually, foreign policy aside, we're always going to be a target here in the UK for people who want to carry out acts of terror?
To an extent, I agree, yeah, but I'd also like to add in a slight degree of nuance and say that if we look at what happened in the 7/7 attacks, it was very clear that the Iraq war was put forward as one of the main reasons why those attacks were carried out. And if we also go back right to the heart of this move towards radical Islamism, you look at the writings of Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb, you see that there was a very clear legacy of colonialism, a very clear legacy of external involvement, external interference in the domestic affairs of Middle Eastern states. That is a very clear root of this problem. And this radical Islamist ideology, it doesn't exist purely in a vacuum. There is a much larger political, social, economic context that helps the ideology to find traction amongst people that as Frank correctly asserts, are people struggling to fit within society, or petty criminals, or people that have had struggle to assimilate within communities. But that when foreign policies have come in and had such a devastating effect on society, particularly in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, you can see that there is this legacy of involvement, and you can see the impact that it's having on people.
Well, I think the problem with that argument is that if you look again at what the terrorists actually say, over time their argument changes on the foreign policy question. So go back and read a book called The Islamist by a man called Ed Hussein. He explains he was radicalised by the Bosnian War, by the fact that propaganda was coming out saying we did not intervene in Bosnia, therefore we didn't care about Muslims, our human rights beliefs were just a charade, and that's what encouraged people like him and Muazzam Beg actually to go out and not go there and become jihadists, but to actually go there and or at least to go down the radical path. The issue is there are many different causes. You have non-intervention in the 1990s, you have intervention in the 2000s, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then you have the case of Syria, where again the propaganda is, look at how the West stands by and lets Assad murder hundreds of thousands of Muslims and does nothing. Again, come and join us. We're the winners here, they're the losers, and actually that's what it does. So the argument changes.
So it's an impossible line to tread then, Frank?
I think, yeah, there's an element of that in the eyes of hardcore jihadists, the West is damned whatever it does. So I would agree with Alan on that one. I mean, if you look at Libya, right, Libya is a mess today, and it's an easy bit of low-hanging fruit to say this is all the fault of the West because they intervened and then abandoned the country. Well, they didn't want to have an army of occupation. If NATO had gone into Libya after the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi, they would have become targets and a focus for a popular sort of let's get the Western Crusaders out of Libya as amongst jihadists. So Libya, I think, is sort of... it's disappointed a lot of people. It should be a success story. It's got massive hydrocarbon reserves, small population, it's on the Mediterranean shores, it's close to Europe. It should be a success. And yet, Colonel Gaddafi and his vile regime held that country in such a vice-like grip. He made sure that Upper Mwala deluge, after him, would come just disaster. And sure enough, the country is sort of fragmented into all these different fiefdoms, which is why it's such an easy breeding ground for extremists.
Dr. Mendoza, I was in recent days, as Frank brings up the issue of Libya, I've been speaking to colleagues at BBC Arabic on the radio who've said to me when they've been in Manchester speaking to Libyans living in Manchester, many of them have said, off camera interestingly, or off microphone, said, it is the foreign policy, actually. That is what is making us really angry. And although I feel integrated in Manchester and I feel like this is my home, I'm very, very angry about what's happening in Libya. And they can understand, not necessarily agree with, but understand why some people would be radicalised as a result of that.
I think foreign policy in general does make people angry. I mean, I gave you the example earlier of non-intervention as well. I mean, there were people in the 1990s, I cited Hussein, Mazenbek, they're not jihadists. These are people who became radical in views because of non-intervention of foreign. They were angry about it. They were angry that people were dying and we were doing nothing about it. There are other people who are angry that people are dying and they think we're somehow responsible for it. The Libyan case is fascinating, though. Fascinating, because if you look at the history of the bomber and his family, why did they flee Libya in the first place? They fled because the Gaddafi regime was targeting them. They were political refugees, essentially. Why did they go back to Libya? It was because the international community, and I stress that word, the international community, had come together to stop Gaddafi from murdering more civilians. They decided to stop that. And
I'm going to have to jump in, and do forgive me, only because I know that we are getting some